I think a lot of people are having the wrong discussions, and a lot of companies are falling into this trap of putting so much operational time into Kubernetes. And that's not the point. These companies are not building software to build really cool Kubernetes clusters.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 202. Go from Docker Compose to Kubernetes using Shipyard. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farsick. Back in December of 2022, we had Benjie on from Shipyard, and that was on the DevOps Toolkit AMA. Now, if you don't watch, those usually happen on Thursdays at 11 a.m. Eastern, and that's over on YouTube. But Victor, when we were talking there, how did all this even come about? I think what happened was you got a message from Benjie saying, look, you're wrong about Docker Compose.
Yeah, something like that. I promise I will not swear on this podcast, so I will not say everything he told me. But the essence is that. I had a video of saying that, hey, if you already have stuff defined in Kubernetes way for production, why don't you use that for developer environment? And then Benjie sends me a message, says, you, my child, you're horribly wrong.
And since we couldn't really get into depth on that live stream, we figured we'd go ahead and bring Benjie on to state his case for us. Now, Benjie is also a podcast co-host for Kubelist. That's Kubelist. And we'll talk about some other things later. Benjie, thanks for coming on today.
Hey, thanks for having me. You just told me that I can't swear, but the whole point of this is for me to yell at Victor and say a bunch of horrible things. No, I'm just kidding. No, it's great to be on. And I didn't actually swear at Victor, I don't think, in the first message. So
but maybe in follow-on messages?
But in the follow-on messages, I definitely said some horrible things. Okay. I talked about, I was doing your mama jokes to him about Kubernetes stuff. I didn't. That's sarcasm, just for the record.
What made you reach out and say Victor was wrong about Docker Compose? I mean, Docker Compose to me, even though I use it here and there, it seems to be a dead tech to me. Am I wrong?
So I don't think it's okay. So I don't think it's dead. That's the first thing I'll say. And I don't think Victor's dead wrong about if you have a really great Kubernetes setup, use Kubernetes YAMLs. If it's Helm, use Helm. If it's customized, if it's Knative. I totally understand that. I do think that Docker Compose doesn't get as much recognition and love as it deserves. I think, ironically, the reason for that is that it was just kind of feature complete like 8 years ago for the most part. So I think that it doesn't get as much cred as it deserves. But I think this is about the bigger problem. And I think the bigger problem is there's no standard application definition that we can use for whatever service in general. And I am super biased. I am a co-founder of Shipyard, and we use Docker Compose predominantly. We do have Kubernetes support as well. That's a new thing, actually, for our application definition, the definition that people use to bring on their applications to the Shipyard platform. But I think that there's a lot of value there. One of the analogies I use when I'm talking with folks is that it's kind of like Microsoft Access, where back in the day, for those that know, you're giggling. For those that don't know, you have no idea what I'm talking about. But for back in the day, internally, everyone would use Microsoft Access to have all these internal tools, right? And that was like, this is like a little baby. Think of like the original SQLite. That's Microsoft Access. And it came with Office back in the day. And then if you really needed to do something, you'd be using Oracle or Microsoft SQL Server or whatever. But 99% of businesses, the internal tooling ran on Microsoft Access. And I think that's a really good parallel for Docker Compose, where every team that I have run into that is at some level of scale, we'll call it more than 5 developers, let's maybe 10 to be safe, has some component of Docker Compose that's being used internally very successfully typically for local development. Also, oftentimes it tends towards people that are doing more front end work. But the point is that running a Kubernetes cluster locally is a huge challenge. You don't need all of that stuff going on necessarily if you're just working on a particular service. I mean, I'm probably diving into this question a little more than you anticipated, but I just think there's a lot of merit to using Docker Compose. I would go ahead and say 90% of every company that has containerization happening has somebody in that company that is using Docker Compose today. You might not know it, but I promise you they do. And I think it doesn't get enough credit for the value it actually brings from a day-to-day development perspective.
The part of what you just said is resonated the most with me is when you said that there is no standard application definition in Kubernetes, or I would even go as far as to say there is no reason to say even standard. There is no application definition in Kubernetes. There is no concept of an application in Kubernetes, which is, from certain perspective, really bad situation. So on that part, I completely agree, right? We desperately need some kind of application definition in Kubernetes. Now, when I say we don't have application definition, I don't mean that we cannot define what an application is. It's just that Kubernetes, from that perspective, reminds me greatly on AWS, right? You cannot say, I want EKS cluster. You need to say, I want EKS cluster with this node pool and that gateway and this subnet and a bunch of other things until you get to the point that you have operational cluster, which is really bad in a way, right? Or maybe we didn't mature enough, or whatever the reasons are. If that's where you were going, I completely agree. We maybe if Kubernetes would be described as AWS, maybe we need something that is effectively producing the same result, but is closer from the user experience to GKE. Kind of, when you create GKE, you just say, I want a GKE cluster. Boom, right? You can tweak it, you can do whatever you want, but still, it's very, very simple. That's a real problem that I think we need to solve somehow. Whether that's Docker Compose or some other solution, to me is almost like a secondary problem in a way.
Yeah, I completely agree with you that, and I would take it even further than just even Kubernetes. Like, there just is no way to define your services. It could be Nomad. I don't know if anyone's using Mesosphere anymore, but any of these things, there's just no standard DSL for saying, I want Redis living over here and I want Kafka over there and whatever. And my Python or my Go application, my Rust application, there's just no standard way of defining that. And without that standard, you run into these problems where you can't do generic things to your infrastructure. Tooling your infrastructure becomes a one-off thing for every service when you're configuring every service by hand. And I love Helm. I really do. We use Helm a bunch, but Helm still doesn't do it because it's still like, you get a Helm chart and like, that's cool, but like you got to tweak it here. And then all of a sudden there's some security update that breaks some configuration that's customized or whatever. Customized with a K. Yeah. So the point is the ecosystem's all over the place. There's no standard way to do it. And just having give me a Redis server that can be for, a very small startup all the way up to, let's call it Google level company, that just doesn't exist. And so I guess I'm advocating for a standard. And what I'm seeing is that in the market today, the closest thing that everyone actually uses is Docker Compose. And so I think my question is how can we take that and extend it, or use it as the base level to build on top of it to actually use all these different types of things as targets? And that's kind of the argument that what I'm making. That being said, like, I totally understand why Docker Compose it's definitely not the cool kids' tool of choice these days. I totally get it. And believe me, I'm a little embarrassed every time. There's a bit of nerd in me that's just like, oh God, Victor's going to tear me apart with the last thing I just said. But I'm standing strong. And Docker Compose has value. I'll say it again. It has a lot of value, and a lot of companies are using it.
Yeah, I mean, no, definitely. I wouldn't even agree with saying it's not a cool kid. I think that few times I post something about Docker that gets like 10 times more views than anything about Kubernetes. So I think that numbers-wise, Docker is much more widely used than Kubernetes. Not necessarily from the perspective of percentage of workloads running in one or the other, right? But from the awareness and people using it directly, it is much bigger than Kubernetes. And this is probably something that will be considered heresy, what I just said, right? So the adoption is definitely there. But I think that the main problem we're having right now, to be clear, I placed bets on my career on Docker at the time. I was a Docker Swarm fanboy, right? And I still miss the days of using Docker Swarm, to be honest. The problem I feel that we're having, and I know that I'm not giving solutions really, is that we have that discrepancy between human usage and machine usage. From the human perspective, Docker is much better interface, right? Honestly, I would work with Docker Compose over Helm. And by the way, I'm going to say another heresy, something that people are going to throw stones at me. I think that Helm is the most ridiculous thing, one of the most ridiculous things ever made by anybody. I think it's just ridiculously bad. But anyways, there is that discrepancy between what humans like to use and where we run things, right? And that discrepancy is, I, as a human, prefer Docker Compose over Helm any time of the day. And then I, as a process, running Kubernetes more likely rather than Docker, right? And that's the clash we are having right now. Will we ever get to the point where we have the simplicity of Docker from the client-side perspective, from the human perspective, and the feature richness of Kubernetes from the, let's say, operational perspective, right? That's the clash.
I mean, I think that's a really good point. And what I would say is that humans are the ones that are going to be. I mean, I don't know. ChatGPT is kind of amazing, but assuming that humans are going to be the ones writing most of the programs, or at least telling ChatGPT what to write, I would say that the human side is where to start for the interface for the application, and then we can programmatically create the machine side based off of transpiling, interpolating, whatever you want to call it, the human interface. And so I think we're actually kind of saying the same thing in that regard, because I completely agree with you. Like, underneath the hood of what I do every day is all generated Kubernetes YAML. I'm not advocating for doing some weird compose. I don't even know what that would look like. I'm advocating. I'm a big CNCFer. Sorry, that sounded like I was swearing. That was not a swear word. CNCFer is a good thing. I'm very nervous about not swearing. Sorry, everybody. But I'm advocating that how can we make Kubernetes more accessible? And then the other thing I would say is that when you get into the machine side of this, to your analogy, is there's a lot of options, and the optionality is really not helpful for humans developing and for moving quickly and developing infrastructure quickly, right? Like, what do I use for ingress? What do I use for my network layer? What do I use for my file system? And you have all these things that, how am I going to make a better choice than someone that's been working on this for a year at Google? Like, they're going to know better. So I really want them to tell me I should use Rook or whatever. And so I want to give this human interface, and what I think Docker Compose is today. And by the way, I'm totally open to someone showing me something else that has more adoption, more, that level of accessibility, but also more adoption. Like, I'm totally open to that. But today it's Docker Compose, in my opinion. But hey, these are the services I have. Here's some ports and some environment variables, and maybe there's some dependencies and health checks I need in there amongst services. Take that and give me production grade Kubernetes YAMLs. That's what I'm advocating for, and that's kind of what we're doing day to day.
I feel that we're talking about the same thing, but I think that we are starting from I feel like we are starting from different points in terms that I tend to go from production towards development, and you might be, and correct me if I'm wrong, going the other way around, but trying to get to the same point, right? And from my perspective, if I now ignore whether it's Docker Compose or what, when we say Docker Compose, what we both mean is probably a simple YAML that a human who did not spend 75 years learning all the intricacy of something can understand, right? That's probably what we mean by Docker Compose, right? A simple definition, simple YAML, right? Now, from the production perspective, the closest one that I feel we have that resembles that is Knative. Knative, from the process perspective, does marvelous things. It runs your application, scales it up, it scales it down, integrates with service meshes. It does all the things that you might need to do. And it is essentially a custom resource definition. It is an operator running in Kubernetes cluster. And all you have to do as a user, define maybe 10, 15 lines of YAML. And that's about it. It's extremely simple. Extremely, extremely simple from the human perspective. And now what's happening in a cluster is madness, right? But that's what's required in a way, right? Production is complex anyways. Now, the problem with that, when I think about it and go from the direction of production towards how can I now enable developers to do the same thing, is that I cannot expect people to run Kubernetes clusters with Knative on their laptop. Cannot expect them to do the whole setup, which is there's some work to be done, right? Once you to define the application, extremely easy. I would say as easy as Docker Compose, doing much more. But I cannot get people to actually have it running in the first place, the setup phase. So that's almost out of the question, right?
I mean, I think I just have to agree with you on that. And that's the biggest problem. In my experience, when I am trying to have a development team run like pure Kubernetes, Knative, whatever it is, Helm, your arch enemy Helm, your SREs are spending like 60, 70% of their time helping developers like debug whatever is wrong with their local Kubernetes cluster. So I think you're going back to what you said, like, yeah, I'm starting from the development perspective and heading up towards production. And that makes sense that you're starting from production and heading back down. But I think that point you just made is right on the money. And that's why it's such a problem, is running Kubernetes locally. It is just not a feasible thing, or it's just not efficient. It's like the opposite of smart.
I can reasonably assume today that, okay, running Kubernetes locally, that's absolutely not a problem. Installing stuff in Kubernetes locally, kind of Istio and Knative and this and that, that's madness. But Kubernetes itself, that's easy. But where I was going to with my story is that I think that both of us are hitting in a way brick wall and looking at that same wall from the different side of that wall, right? I have Knative, and I'm using it as an example that is extremely easy for anybody to define how their application should run in production. Somebody else set it up, but it's extremely easy to define how it will run in production, but I cannot run that locally. And then your side of the wall, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm kind of paraphrasing what I understood that you're saying is that, hey, I have something that every developer can run locally, but then they hit the same wall when they try to jump to production, because now this thing cannot do what needs to be done in production, right? So I cannot make my Knative work in locally, and you cannot make Docker Compose work in production in a way, right?
I think that's exactly right. And so that's why you need that in-between piece to turn Docker Compose into a different target for the application itself. And I'm obviously very biased about the right way to do that, Shipyard. But again, it comes back to like, what is the application definition that gives us that interoperability both up and down? And to me, again, I think that if you start with the human side, then you could go to the machine side. If you start with the machine side, going back down to the human side, then I don't know. That's tough.
Where does open application model fit into this? Or will it ever?
it fits into the similar story like my version of the story with Knative, in terms that I can use open application model, kubevela, to make it extremely easy for somebody to define their production application. Very, very easy. That will do everything that I need to be done in production. But I need to have a team of people who actually set it up in production, right? So kind of what comes before my application, in a way, right? And then moving that complexity, installing open application model with all the components and traits and what's or not locally is unrealistic. In Kubernetes, when you can make things simple at the expense of operational complexity. And you cannot move that operational complexity to a local cluster, right? And that's kind of an issue. And I'm going to drop something. The only solution I see right now where actually everybody could be potentially satisfied is remote environments. If we choose to use X, whatever X is, doesn't matter whether it's Knative or it's open application model or some third solution, compose something based, doesn't matter. If we use remote clusters for both production and development, then the operational effort is there, kind of like is done, right? Kind of like I set up my X in this cluster or those clusters in plural, and you do not need to worry about your local cluster. And yet you can leverage whatever simpler way we figured out would be used to define what your application is.
Right. So like the Git pods of the world and stuff like that.
Git pod, namespaces, big clusters, everybody gets their own cluster, whatever. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that I'm not sure I see the exit without moving people's development environments outside of their laptops.
I mean, I definitely see that being the direction we're going, but it kind of reminds me of like the Sunblade servers from like a long time ago, and I'm dating myself a little bit right now. But you know, they that was a mainframe that you just have a terminal into has been the proposed model since computer science started, and it always seems to die somehow. So that's just like a feeling I have. There's no reason for it, but I do think remote environments are pretty cool and definitely make a lot of sense. There's a few limitations there. One is, especially in the remote world that we live in, internet is not always there. I mean, Starlink's getting pretty cool, but like you're not always going to have internet. So that's one issue. Call me old school, but flying across the country, I live in New York. I have family in Los Angeles. I go to San Francisco. The most productive time that I ever have writing code is always on flights across this country. I swear to God, I've written like 90% of the best code I've ever written in my life, just flying across the country. I'm focused, but I don't necessarily have the internet there. I try to take JetBlue, so I often do. But I do think that taking away the ability to develop without the internet, I don't know if we're ever going to fully get there. And I think that there are shortfalls to it. But I'd bring up another point, and that is like what are we doing? Like, why do you need to, like, the machines that we are recording this podcast on are, they're supercomputers. They're super duper computers for 1960, let alone 1970, let alone the 80s. The bloat of software, my spider sense about how ridiculous software has become, from Doom to whatever Xbox game that's 100 gigabytes versus the 4 megabytes that Doom was, that also tingles a little bit when we talk about remote environments. That all being said, I do think remote dev environments are definitely going to be 80-90% of the solution here.
Let me for a second challenge what you said. I'm picturing you in a plane. Does that mean that you have preloaded all the images you might need?
Yeah.
That's a challenge as well, right? Kind of like that's already increases the complexity. I can very easily say Docker compose this or that will download Postgres for me and run it. But if you tell me, Victor, you need to learn how to preload images locally, then
Well, no, sorry. I'm saying working on a plane. I mean, this is a little, we're getting a little too in the weeds on this one, but what I really mean is working on an existing project that I've already have running locally. I have never started a project from scratch on the plane. And I think that would be a horrible idea. So I'm not actually saying that that's a good idea. Yeah, no, I did there because I'm just no, I would never start a project. I'm just thinking of how bad it would be to do a pull on a Docker hub from JetBlue's internet. And also, I don't know if you know this, but there's this, because of 2FA on GitHub, you can't actually commit source code for whatever reason on planes. I don't know if anyone's ever run into this. Maybe there's a solution now, but you can never use Git on, or at least Git with GitHub on a plane. I can't remember why, but do you guys know what I'm talking about? Do you remember? Have you ever run into this?
I tend to watch Netflix on planes. That's the only moment I'm not writing code, when I'm flying. I'm the opposite of you.
All right. Well, I mean, this makes a lot of sense then, where I'm coming from the human perspective, you're coming from the machine perspective. Yeah, it's like we reluctantly agree on everything, but we're just completely coming from different sides of the same story. Tell me this though, what about cost? What about the cost of running? Because I've seen so many pieces of infrastructure that are just, I don't want to use the word bloated, but overkill. Right. And so you've got 15 developers and they're each having to run a full cluster to actually have a simulation or approximation of production. And, these things are, there's a Kafka cluster, there's a Rabbit cluster, there's a Redis, there's a 20 different application microservices. There's a cost factor to that for these remote dev environments.
To me, that's an overkill. I would never recommend somebody to create their own personal environment that has the whole system, all the shenanigans, everything, that whole Google system running there. But in my head, that's equally valid no matter whether it's remote or local. I'm not going to run Oracle and Kafka and I don't know, 57 other things that I normally need for production. I will probably run the few things that I really, really, really need and either mock the rest or connect to Kafka running somewhere, shared Kafka, right?
I gotcha, but wasn't your argument that that you can run the same exact stuff that you're doing in production on a remote cluster? So if you're all of a sudden mixing and matching that, I mean, from a chaos monkey perspective, that makes a lot of sense. But if you're mixing and matching that, then you still don't have that parity between production and what you're running. So you have the same setup that you're doing anyways, if you were just running Docker Compose up and turning on 3 services, and it's the same disparity.
Yeah, but
right?
So let's say that we are working on a system that we have 100 microservices and 27 different databases and what's not, the whole company, right? I do want to get closer to production within reason. I do not want to run the whole. Okay, so our production is 257 servers. Each of us is going to spin up that number of servers. That's not going to work neither locally nor remotely, or at least if it works, it will work for 3 months and then we are all going to close the doors and go bankrupt, right? So when I say close to production, I mean, let's say my application that I'm developing, the closer it can get to production, the better. Now, whether that means that the rest of the system I will connect to, right? We need Kafka. Sometimes I can run it locally or in my environment. Sometimes I might connect to Kafka in staging environment, right? So I can mock it, whatever that. But I'm mostly referring to the application in question, the one that I'm developing, right? Because realistically, if we talk about a huge bank, nobody can spin up the whole system. Doesn't matter which technology we use, kind of. Most likely, actually, there is no single person who knows how to spin up production itself from scratch, right? Let's face it. There is mainframe over there, and I'm not running it locally. Let's clarify it from the very beginning, right?
You're making the point that, you're never going to, for the larger systems, you're never going to run the whole thing. So having logical breaks in what you're actually running in the remote environments makes sense. And I agree with that. I would just extend that down to local because, again, we all have these M1, M2. I mean, I actually still run x86, but super machines. So are you laughing at me for running x86? Are you making fun of me for? Yeah. Oh, well, I love my keyboard. Okay. I won't let the Retina go. Yeah. No, I literally have a problem. That's a different issue. But yeah, there is just, I mean, this is not a really great point, but there is a lot of waste. Like these laptops that we all have are really good. We should be able to run at least a piece of the application that we're working on locally. There is a speed component, but you could also make the argument that when you're running in a remote environment, you get a lot more juice. So I don't know. I wouldn't really make the speed argument necessarily. Like there's like latency and network stuff, but maybe disk. If you're running on Azure, the disk IO is going to be worse than your laptop. I promise you that. But yeah, I mean, there's trade-offs. But ultimately, I think that as a developer, I want optionality of being disconnected or working on a remote environment. So that's just me. But again, I think I'm probably in the minority at this point of wanting to do everything on my laptop. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Again, there's always that balance between, you cannot have it all and stuff. But in that case, I would argue, so let's say that if my application is not super duper complicated, complex, whatever, right? Something that I could, let's say it's something that I can define in Docker Compose, that is possible, right? Because I cannot define serverless as Docker Compose. It's not going to happen, right? But I can define something equivalent to an ingress deployment and a service with Docker Compose. That's reasonable. When I say I can define that with Docker Compose, I don't mean literally that, but something that will have a similar effect as those 3 Kubernetes components, right?
Right. You're not actually going to define your ingress ever. Maybe using Nginx.
NIPIO when you're not flying.
Yes.
Okay. Doesn't matter. Okay, maybe no ingress, service and deployment, right? Still, what I'm saying in that case is, and this is where we might disagree greatly, if it's something like that, then, hey, I already have exactly that defined as a Helm chart. I can just do Helm install just as easily as Docker Compose up. That's my real pitch.
But you're talking about at the we're not talking about remote.
Yeah, that doesn't matter. Remote, local. Kubernetes running somewhere, local, let's say. Minikube, Docker. Okay, I'm using Docker desktop on my machine. I can just as easily execute Helm install as Docker Compose up, with the difference is that I do not even have to define Docker Compose file.
Okay, that's fair, but what about when you want to add an environment variable? Or what about as a developer, not as a DevOps person, but as a developer, I'm working on a front end. I'm working on my React app. Okay, I'm a front end developer, and I need to add a API key for segment.io or I don't know, something, full story, whatever. And I need to add an environment variable. Doing that in Helm in particular, and I know you're not a big fan of Helm, so I got to understand the templating. Like, wait, so I do this at the Kubernetes level? Is Tiller running? Oh wait, I'm using Helm 3 or am I using Helm 2?
Okay, if you find me a person who is using Helm 2 still, let me know where that person lives, and I will put him out of his misery.
I've signed confidentiality contracts, so I can't tell you. But I mean, I think that might be, maybe that's part of my perspective. Is before I was doing Shipyard, I was consulting, and I did a lot of Kubernetes but Docker Kubernetes consulting. And I always would do the same mistake where I'd give these people these Helm charts. At the time, it was Helm 2. This was like 5 years ago, so don't get mad at me. It was a nightmare. It was just a big nightmare trying to have developers iterate on that. Whereas I would be like, okay, how were you doing this before? And they were like, Docker Compose. And I was like, what? That's so lame. Like, what are you talking about? Like, use this cool, flashy new toy, Helm. And then at some point I was like, oh, Customize is so much better. Use Customize. And I just always kept coming on the ground. I kept coming back to folks that were not necessarily the most adept DevOps practitioners, i.e. front-end folks, that were able to quickly iterate using Docker Compose. And that's how I got here. Like I was on the same exact page as you, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, maybe even less than that actually. But I think you said it really eloquently. Like I am really approaching this from a human perspective. How can we enable developers to move quickly? And I think a big piece of that is the tooling that we have has just gone haywire. Like it's just crazy to try and ask a front end developer or even a back end developer, so a big Ruby person to like, hey, you need to understand this templating language and you need to understand the upstream constraints. And oh, there's a new CVE that came out and you got to use this patch with, the we can go on and on about these hypotheticals, but I think that that's a real limitation. So I think you're totally right. I'm just really have a lot of experience looking at it from the human side. And that really is what I'm trying to enable and what we're trying to do over at Shipyard. But as a nerd, I completely agree with you about everything you've said. The nerd in me is like so embarrassed for making this argument. The human in me is like, you're doing God's work.
I don't think it's embarrassing or anything like that. I might be trashing some of the ideas, but I don't have a solution to begin with. The real issue here is, I think, history of containers. Docker started from the user experience perspective and never managed to reach production. Kubernetes started from production perspective, kind of like, what are the requirements? It's actually from two perspectives: production and being a base, extensible base, which added to the complexity greatly, and never reached the experience. Those are the, if those two, Kubernetes and I'm greatly simplifying Docker, started from different points and hit that same wall in a way that I was explaining before, right? Kind of, hey, you cannot cross this wall into production, and Kubernetes got to the other side of the wall and concluded that not yet it can actually reach the developer experience in a way, right?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. You know what's interesting, and it just came into my brain, the thing that Kubernetes and the thing that Docker definitely share, the strongest thing, is the community behind both of them. So it's interesting. I don't know why that pops out into my brain, but it's just like I think that what Kubernetes has done outside of the technical side is the community they've built is crazy. And same thing for Docker. So somehow we have to merge those two together. I don't know what the solution is. Docker Compose is the answer.
Community is actually, in a way, illustrates what I previously said. Because both Docker and Kubernetes had and still have amazingly huge, massive communities, but very different communities. Kubernetes community is very much focused around people building Kubernetes, meaning contributing to Kubernetes, kind of ops people, coders. And when I say coders, I mean everybody's a coder, but I mean Kubernetes developers, right? Building components for Kubernetes. Not that much from the user perspective. And then we have Docker community equally large, which is the other way around, right? There was miserable amount of contributions to Docker outside Docker company. Miserably small compared to the total of contributions from Docker as a company. But the community was incredibly, and still is, incredibly large, right? That kind of illustrates those two different directions, right? Kind of, I'm starting as a user, and I'm starting from that experience, and I have difficulty reaching production. And then the other one, Kubernetes. No, I'm starting as I dedicated my life to this thing. I never developed front-end application in my life type of perspective or starting point, and I cannot reach the experience, right? That to me, that the trajectory is very well reflected in the community or the stereotype or the average user or member of that community.
I mean, I think that's exactly right. And I hate to say it, but the truth is that the Kubernetes, not everyone should know Kubernetes. In fact, Kubernetes should basically be, I would say, for the majority of developers, abstracted away from them. And as a big Kubernetes person, like I've got a podcast called Kubelist. Okay. We interview only CNCF projects. So I've got my credentials, but I mean, I can make the argument for Nomad. It's the cluster, or I didn't like Swarm as much as you did, but Swarm, I like the simplicity of Swarm, but it doesn't really matter. I'm never going to argue for Mesosphere because that was just too expensive.
That doesn't work for anybody. But kind of like, Swarm works for some type of users and Kubernetes for others. Nomad doesn't work. Sorry, Mesos doesn't work for anybody except who is it? Facebook.
Yeah, I don't mean to pick on. I don't want to pick on Mesos, but underneath the hood, like I think a lot of people are having the wrong discussions, and a lot of companies are falling into this trap of like, putting so much operational time into Kubernetes. And that's not the point. These companies are not building software to build really cool Kubernetes clusters. And like you said, like GKE is like, you click a button and you're good to go. EKS is okay. You still have to do cloud formation. I think I think you could do stuff without cloud formation now. But yeah, this is just not what people should be worrying about. And that is what the community is focused on. And then people like get sucked in. But I do think we're sacrificing who we're servicing, and who we're servicing are developers and end users. And ultimately, end users are not rewarded if developers are tearing their hair out trying to use this tool. So I think that's the struggle. I hate to use the word struggle because that sounds so stupid, but that's the conflict, maybe.
I'm optimistic in terms that you said a few minutes ago, nobody should see Kubernetes. I think that we are going to get there. I do not know how. I do not know how that will look like, but it will become equivalent of hypervisors. Who knows how hypervisors work? Find me that person, and that will be 1 out of 100, right?
The guy that wrote Heartbleed knows how hypervisors work.
But everybody's using them, right? Everybody uses hypervisors.
Yeah,
nobody knows that they're doing it, but they do. Kubernetes will eventually. Now, whether that's 1 year, 5 years, 10 years from now, I do not know. We'll get there. To me, the closest example I can find right now, and this in no way solves the problem that we're talking about. What I'm going to say has nothing to do with development environments, but that direction of Kubernetes becoming something that nobody cares about, to me, is reflected in Azure Container Apps. And I'm not fond of Azure, just to clarify. I don't know if you use Azure Container Apps, but basically, essentially, you say, hey, here's my container image. Do something with it. But that leaves us with the same problem that we're discussing all this time. Kind of like, I know how I can make that run as Azure Container Apps, but I'm not very likely going to use Azure Container Apps while developing Azure Container App.
Right. So it's kind of like, I'm not familiar with Azure Container Apps, but it sounds like it's like ECS.
Yeah. Here's my container image, run it. And, it will expose a port, give you a domain. If you don't have it, it will scale it up and down every 100 requests or whatever. So it does the things, right? The things you need it to do. But you as a human, you just say, here's my container image. I mean, you can specify other things, right? But in its sense, if you want to keep it as simple as possible, here's my container image.
And that's kind of like, if you have Knative working well, it's kind of Knative.
Yeah, also, I intentionally said Azure Container Apps instead of Google Cloud Run, which is based on Knative, mostly because Google Cloud Run does not run on Kubernetes, even though Knative does.
Oh, it doesn't?
It doesn't? No. I was also confused for a while, but then I discovered, hey, it's Knative, designed for Kubernetes, but Google Cloud Run is based on Knative. Doesn't run on Kubernetes. It's a mystery. It doesn't matter, but
it runs on Borg or something.
Yeah, I think that they designed their own solution and mostly implemented Knative API more than anything else. Irrelevant, but kind of that type of simplicity. Now, if I would follow that line of thought, and let's say Azure Container Apps, what I would really like to see next is to have some kind of Azure CLI that says, run Azure Container Apps engine locally so that I can do the same thing. Now, that's very limited because what's the market share of Azure Container Apps? If they are successful, it will be 0.1%, right? But that level of simplicity, yes, I want that. What I really, really want, and I cannot get, and I don't think that you will give me that or anybody else anytime soon, is simplicity of Docker with doing what needs to be done in production. Kind of like,
Are you trying to get me to plug Shipyard right
yeah,
now?
if
Or
Shipyard
I
can
don't
give me
understand.
kind of like serverless application that scale up and down, have mutual TLS between them and all that jazz, yes.
Yeah, I mean, the word serverless is a little loaded, so I'm not sure. Like, I don't know which version of serverless you're referring to, but I think the one you're talking to, that, I mean, yes, we can give you that, but right now we suggest use Docker Compose to develop it locally, and then we take your Docker Compose and we transpile that to best practice Kubernetes and give you all kinds of super mojo with exactly what you talked about, with the TLS in between services and your own running Kubernetes cluster with all kinds of ephemeral. I mean, I don't want to.
No,
I'm not
but
trying to.
you should, because what you just described, I think that this goes back before we started recording this podcast. What you're just describing is what I really want. And so let me explain what I want. I want to have a single set of manifests with minimal variations that I can run locally and in production. And I honestly don't care whether that's Docker Compose or it's, I don't know, fill in the blank, whatever you want. I honestly don't care. What I don't want is to have testers define application like this, developers like that, ops people like that, and it's all the same application.
I mean, that's exactly what we're working on over at Shipyard, and we do use Docker Compose right now as the base application definition. We do have Kubernetes support. Don't get me wrong. We are doing that. That's by popular demand. But I don't believe in it. I have a saying. I say nay, not another YAML. I really think that one of the things that I've observed is just like everyone's like, oh, I'm just going to have my own YAML. And you're just like, dude, it's just another abstraction layer on top of another abstraction layer on top of another abstraction layer. It's the Helm problem that we kind of just talked about, where it's just like, where does it stop? So what we're doing at Shipyard is we take your Docker Compose and we use that as an application definition. And where we're going is we want to take other application definitions and we take that and we generate raw Kubernetes manifests. And then we use those manifests to have pretty cool, powerful, ephemeral environments that are generated on every pull request. And the thing you can do when you control the end manifest, i.e. the Kubernetes manifest, it's like defining the pods and services, all that stuff, is you can arbitrarily put an ingress in front of it. And like, you don't have to worry about the ingress. We're handling that. You can snapshot volumes beneath that because volumes are just arbitrary. You can put SSO in front of that. And these are all things that we do today. And what that gives us is the ability to dynamically auto scale these environments, auto shape these environments, kind of get to the point where, we're pretty confident, hey, this is the amount of resources you're going to need to run your application with all these services going. Here's all your dependencies. And then we generate these Kubernetes YAMLs, and then you give you a really good experience. You can turn these environments off and on. Obviously, these are all images tagged by your commit SHA. And so you just get this reproducibility. And that's what we're working on. In regards to the production component of this, that's not the focus that we have right now. But I will say, people know, we do actually offer a component here for taking those YAMLs and then running them in your own production cluster. And so the long-term idea is that you have one application definition, it defines everything, and then you get all of this other DX or developer experience baked in because you're defining it in one place, and then you could just have all this stuff on top of it. Does that make sense, Victor?
Oh yeah. That's what I want, really. I want to have one definition for an application working here and there. That's the objective.
Yeah, and I put Shipyard aside. I completely agree with you on that, and that is what I think we need to do. And again, the comment you used earlier that I think was great was the human approachable interface for your application. that is the key to productivity on the developer side. And so I think that we need to have a good interface for folks to build out their applications and then get the target YAMLs or whatever you want to call it based on that nice human interaction. And so thus my reaching out to you to tie it back together about, hey, Docker Compose isn't all bad. It actually defines most things and you get most of the things you need out of it, and you can infer the rest. And you should have people that know what to inferring. And that's what you can do with things like Docker Compose. But I'm super open to some other standard. But the big trick there is you got to find something that everyone actually is using. And I'm yet to see anything that even comes close to the level of adoption that Docker Compose has. This is what I would say to your audience. Look at you all probably work at software companies. Do a little forensic work and find out if there is a Docker Compose file in some of the repositories. I promise you that you will find one. Reach out to Victor on DevOpsToolkit.com. I don't know the URL or the Twitter handle, but reach out to Victor. Prove me wrong or prove me right. Tell me if you can't find somebody at your company that's using Docker Compose. And that's really the human part of it, is really what I'm saying is like, hey, we have a solution. It's not perfect, but no solutions ever are. How do we build on top of the thing that's solved, which is getting humans to use it? That is always the hardest thing, adoption.
So you can find Shipyard at shipyard.build, not .com, but shipyard.build. Benjie, if people wanted to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Benjie at shipyard.build is my email. Feel free to reach out. Our Twitter is shipyardbuild. LinkedIn is, I don't know what our LinkedIn is. Search for Shipyard on our LinkedIn. I have no idea what our LinkedIn is, but Twitter's a good way to interact with us. I don't have a personal Twitter. I'm not a big tweeter, but I kind of use the Shipyard Twitter.
We know about you not tweeting. You don't have a mobile phone either, so I do not expect you to use Twitter.
I'm not a big believer in these things, but just for the record, my actual Twitter handle is twitter.com/Bueller. And that's my actual handle. And I have one tweet from 2008 and it says, I don't believe in Twitter. So I'm not a newfound hater on Twitter. I've always hated all of this stuff. I don't think it's healthy for any of us, but I do think it's a good way to connect with folks that want to talk about CNCF and nerd stuff. I don't think any of the other topics that are discussed on Twitter are particularly healthy for the human mind. Not the point of this podcast. Benjie at shipyard.build. Check us out, shipyard.build. And also big proponents of ephemeral environments. So if you are looking at ephemeral environment stuff and you don't want to use Shipyard, that's totally fine. But there's a cool open source resource called ephemeralenvironments.io that you should check out. And also co-host of the podcast Kubeless. Check us out at kubeless.com.
We'll have all that information down in the show notes. Benjie, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, guys.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.